Welcome back to Kide MMA, guys. And as you see on the title, just how good was Daniel Cormier? People tend to forget Daniel Cormier was the double champ light heavyweight champion and the heavyweight champion. But unfortunately for Daniel Cormier, his career and legacy is somewhat overshadowed by his two losses to Jon Jones. One of his losses was overturned due to Jon Jones testing positive for pits, but fans still remember what took place that night when he lost via TKO. So these moments, against Jon Jones, it really shadows the greatness that Daniel Cormier displayed in the octagon. The most insane thing about Daniel Cormier's career is he made his debut at the age of 30. Not in his 20s, but at the age of 30 directly after the Olympics. So we're talking about an Olympic wrestler transitioning to MMA. Now DC trained at one of the best gyms that a fighter can train at, which was aka American Kickboxing Academy, headed by Javier Mendez. So many great fighters have come from that camp, from Luke Rockhold to Cain Velasquez to John Fitch Khabib and Islam. And he went on a tear at heavyweight. To be honest, that is very rare to see. For many fighters, a lot of fighters start off with losses here and there. They may get a couple wins. They have a loss, but not for DC. Daniel Cormier tore through every single person. He started out in Strikeforce. Strikeforce had what was called the Strikeforce Challengers, which was somewhat similar to the NBA's G League. We have the up-and-coming fighters taking on other up-and-coming fighters. And DC's first two appearances on Strikeforce Challengers, he went 2-0. And after that, he took a couple of fights outside of Strikeforce, continuing on his winning streak, going 4-0, then finally, in August of 2010, he returned back to Strikeforce, and this is where he made his debut on TV, on the Strikeforce Houston event where he took on heavyweight Jason Riley and defeated him in the first round. After his TV debut, Daniel Cormier went on another two-fight win streak before he debuted once again on a Strikeforce TV event, and this was Strikeforce over Eam versus Werdum, where he took on veteran Jeff Monson. Now at the time, Jeff Monson was DC's biggest test because, as I said, Jeff Monson is a very experienced guy who's fought all over the globe in the UFC, and he's a very tough guy now. At the time, Strikeforce had a Grand Prix going on, and with Daniel Cormier winning this fight against Monson, he was actually entered into the Grand Prix as a reserve, and only a few months later he got the call, and he was in the semifinals of the Strikeforce Grand Prix taking on Antonio Bigfoot Silva. Going from Jeff Monson to Bigfoot Silva is a massive jump, because at the time Antonio Bigfoot Silva had just defeated Fedor Emelianenko. Bigfoot Silva was the top dog in Strikeforce, and DC literally at this time was only 8-0, but a total of 8 MMA fights altogether, where Antonio Bigfoot had over 16 fights, and he had just defeated one of the greatest heavyweight champions of all time in the cage. So I couldn't even imagine the type of pressure that was on DC going into this fight, but like the stud DC was, he finished Antonio Bigfoot Silva by knockout in the very first round, shocking the world. And after that knockout, that put DC in the finals of the Grand Prix tournament, where he took on the tough freestyle wrestler Josh Barnett. Josh Barnett was another experienced fighter who had fought in Pride. He had been all over the globe fighting, and he had fought in the UFC also. And Daniel Cormier defeated Josh Barnett by 5-round decision, crowning him the Strikeforce heavyweight Grand Prix champion. With everything Daniel Cormier had accomplished at this time, he was now on the radar of the UFC, but he ended up going on to have one more fight in Strikeforce, and that was against Dion Staring, where he finished him in the very first round by TKO. And after that win, he got the call to take on Frank Mir at UFC Fox. Now the UFC is a totally different league from Strikeforce now. Around this time, the UFC had most of the top heavyweights, so DC was jumping straight into the deep end, no warm-up fights. He was taking on Frank Mir. Now he didn't get the finish, but he did defeat Frank Mir by 3rd-round decision, and he looked great. Doing so, just looking at his record right now as a 12-0 fighter, he had a lot of great wins on that list for somebody who was fairly new and green to the sport, And obviously the biggest thing was he had the wrestling pedigree to back it up. After the Frank Mir fight, he took on Big Country Roy Nelson and won by decision, and at this point he was 13-0. And then he went into his very first, I guess you can call it grudge match, with another wrestler by the name of Patrick Cummins, who trained with DC and bragged about how he made DC cry when they faced off in training. And if you guys are MMA fans, or if you ever trained, usually what happens in training stays in training. But Patrick decided he wanted to tell the world, and DC ended up making him pay for every last bit of it, where he finished Patrick in the very first round. And it wasn't even close, as for Patrick Cummins, this was actually his debut at light heavyweight. After the Patrick Cummins fight, he took on Dan Hendo Hollywood Henderson, who he absolutely manhandled. I mean, I've never seen anyone do what DC did to Dan Henderson. Henderson is a great wrestler himself. Dan Henderson also competed in the Olympics in wrestling. So we're talking about a guy with high-level wrestling, but taking on DC was a whole different story. I think the biggest difference in this fight was that Dan Henderson is not a natural big light heavyweight. He fought most of his career at middleweight. So he was taking on Daniel Cormier, a guy who cut down from heavyweight. So come fight night, Daniel Cormier was much bigger, and you just saw the raw power difference. And Daniel Cormier ended up finishing Dan Henderson by rear naked choke in the third round, and it was an absolute flawless performance now. After DC's impressive win against Dan Henderson, he was called for a title shot against Jon Jones. And oddly about this situation, these guys didn't really hate each other in the beginning. It all stemmed from allegedly Jon Jones making a comment to DC out in public some years back that he could take DC down according to Jon Jones. DC got upset about the comment, and that basically stemmed the rivalry. But that little disagreement ended up leading to the biggest rivalry in MMA history. I mean, you guys saw it from the fight that took place at the press conference. The arguments on ESPN, just complete mayhem. But it was a joy to watch. Now, unfortunately for DC, this would be his very first loss. And in this fight, Jon Jones actually did take Daniel Cormier down, which a lot of people were shocked by, because that was a question going into this fight. Could Jon Jones take down Daniel Cormier? You've seen Jon Jones in the past take on NCAA wrestlers before, like Ryan Bader, and you know he was able to actually out-wrestle them. So the question was, can he do it to an Olympic-level wrestler? And he did. Unfortunately, after this fight, there was no shaking of the hands, because it was so much animosity now. After this fight, Jon Jones was stripped of his light heavyweight belt. DC takes on Anthony Rumble Johnson. You guys know Anthony Rumble Johnson, one of the hardest hitters to ever grace this octagon. And of course, he did not disappoint in that very first round. In the very first exchange, he hit DC so hard. DC went flying across that cage, and for a second it looked like DC was going to be in trouble. But DC, being the great fighter that he is, he was able to recover. He was able to out-wrestle Rumble and take him down and defeat him by rear naked choke in the third round. After this matchup, DC goes on to take on Alexander Gustafsson, and this was actually a very close fight, but DC pulls it off, and at this point Daniel Cormier is 17-1. And just listening to all the names that I just named you guys, how are you not impressed at this point? This is probably one of the most impressive runs that I've ever seen, just at this point in his career. Now, the biggest event of the year is upon us, UFC 200, and Daniel Cormier is set to fight Jon Jones in a rematch, but unfortunately Jon Jones gets pulled from the bout, and DC is very upset. DC still wants to fight, and so they pull in Anderson, the Spider Silva, who steps up on very, very short notice to take on DC. And of course the fight went exactly as expected. DC took Anderson Silva down, not even putting himself at risk, because even with Anderson Silva at this stage in his career, he was still a very dangerous fighter, and it would have been very foolish of DC to try to strike with Anderson Silva for all 3 rounds. So he did the smart thing, take him down after this. DC goes on to take on Rumble Johnson once again, and he wins. The same way he won the very first fight this time. He finishes it by rear naked choke in the second round. A few months later, DC finally gets the rematch that he wanted. And that was against Johnny Bones Jones. And unfortunately for DC, it did not go his way. He was finished in the third round by a beautiful head kick landed by Jon Jones, and followed up by some punches at the end. But as time goes on, that fight is overturned because Jon Jones tests positive, and therefore Daniel Cormier retains his light heavyweight championship belt, and DC goes on to defend his belt one more time against Volkan with a second-round finish at UFC 220. Now at this point, DC has been through the entire light heavyweight division. Daniel Cormier fought every top contender in the light heavyweight division before moving up to heavyweight to face the always tough Stipe Miocic. Shockingly, he knocked out Stipe in the first round to win the heavyweight championship while still holding the UFC Light Heavyweight title. Only a few fighters like Conor McGregor can make that claim. DC then defeated fan favorite Derek Lewis in the second round by rear naked choke, showing his impressive submission game. Starting MMA at 30 years old in 2009, and now fighting at 39 in 2019, DC was no longer in his prime. Fighting at heavyweight is always dangerous,